First, since I think at least two people are meeting me for the first time, I think. I don't think I've met June or Ray. I first got interested in Wilhelm Reich in 1962 when I read The Function of the Orgasm. And in 63, I started therapy with someone trained by Dr. Reich, someone known to people in this room as Dr. Sobey, the infamous Dr. Sobey. I've sort of been familiar with this material, but I took a break from it for a long period. There was a period in my life where I felt knowing this stuff was useless. There was nothing I could do with it except weed my own garden, and I was doing that. But in 2004, I sort of got re-energized, and for the last few years, I've been working on a book on Reich's social and political thought, which is what I've mostly spoken on. Today, I'm going to branch out a bit, and I have able assistants in the form of Dr. Weitzner and Dr. Lewis, and then by phone, Dr. Jim Strick will be speaking, and then another person will also be on the phone later. So I have a PhD in philosophy from NYU. So we're going to start with a philosophy class, and there will be a quiz, so take careful notes. There are four philosophical commitments that Wilhelm Reich manifests in his work. And I want to just quickly say a few words about each of them, and I put them up so you won't have to worry about them. And by the way, I'd sort of like to go without interruption, and then there'll be questions, and then the next speaker, briefly, questions, blah, blah, blah. Unless I say something you can't understand or if I mumble. We're going to have to close that door, I think, Liz. Okay. Well, we also have the painters right outside here. So Reich was a naturalist, and what this means is that he had a commitment to the belief that what is natural is good. And in fact, he didn't think you really needed to teach morality or teach people to do the right thing. He felt that if people were not interfered with, they would naturally do the right thing. And what they would do would be a good thing. So, for example, with children, his belief in self-regulation wasn't just about eating and sleeping. It was also about their interaction with other children. And if the kids had not been emotionally and sexually and other ways repressed, they would naturally do the right thing. And what is natural is good for Reich, but what is not natural is not only bad in some sense, but also irrational. Here's a quote from Reich Speaks of Freud, and I went back and reread this carefully because I'm talking about psychoanalysis, and this is Reich reflecting on his relationship with Freud. So if you haven't read this book, it's a really interesting book. Reich Speaks of Freud. And it basically, half of the book is an interview that Reich gave to Kurt Eisler of the Freud Archive to be stored in the Freud Archive. So here's Reich. If you have a stream, a natural stream, you must let it stream. If you dam it up somewhere, it goes over the banks. That's all. Now, when the natural streaming of the bioenergy is dammed up, it also spills over, resulting in irrationality, perversions, neuroses, and so on. What do you have to do to correct this? You must get the stream back into its normal bed and let it flow naturally again. So here you hear the word natural being used, and the assumption that if it's flowing naturally, then everything is fine. And it's only when it gets dammed up, when you move away from what's, quote, natural, that problems occur. This puts Reich on direct collision course with Freud, as we will see, because Freud, as you may know, believed that repression of sexuality was absolutely necessary. It was necessary because the young child was polymorphous perverse. It was also necessary because he felt that civilization was impossible without the damming up of, or what he called sublimation of sexual energy. It's interesting that Freud's clearest statement of this is the book Civilization and Its Discontents. The last time Reich spoke in Freud's inner circle was December 12th, 1929, and where he spoke on the prevention of neuroses, prophylaxis of neuroses, I think is the name of the paper. And that was the last time he saw it. It was a Thursday. The next night, Reich caused a riot, and you'll hear more about this in the third talk of the day. But it's clear that there's a big difference between Freud and Reich on this issue of, quote, what's natural. Now, there's a related concept that's not philosophical, but there's a movement in Europe called Naturism. And Naturism was this notion that being exposed to the sun was very good. It gave rise to nude sunbathing in a very popular way, and not at all licentious the way it sometimes gets translated in more repressive cultures like ours, where, the nude beach is hard to find kind of thing. I love to go wandering, getting out into the woods, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this great picture of Reich with Elsa and Eva, and they're stripped to the waist, dancing on the beach, and there's these wonderful pictures of Reich sitting where you have the impression from the way he's sitting that he himself is probably naked, etc. That's different from naturalism, though I think that this movement of naturism was very popular in Europe, may explain the easy move towards having patients disrobe. That having patients disrobe, which he started around 1937-38, was not such a big deal in Europe the way in this country it's, oh my God, you're going to jail, you're abusing your patients, you're doing all that terrible stuff. Okay, so that's naturalism. Am I talking too quickly? No.
One time you said naturism.
Naturism is different from naturalism. Naturism is this thing about going out into nature and taking off your clothes.
So what's naturalism?
Naturalism is this whole notion that what is natural is good. Okay. Reich is also a materialist. That is, he clearly believes that there are no disembodied psychic entities. There's no such thing as a mind. There's no such thing as a soul. Whatever psychological entities like thoughts, emotions, feelings, he had a philosophical commitment to belief that those were instantiated on some physical way, even if we didn't quite know how they were instantiated. That is, for Reich, and he ultimately comes to believe this, psyche and soma are one. They're just two different ways of thinking about one thing. And the famous orgonomic image, you have it on your schedule for today. If you look at the top of the page, you see these two arrows pointing towards each other. Well, you can put psyche and soma on those two antithetical but nonetheless identical beings or aspects of humanity. This means that if you recognize something on a psychological level, for example, characterological armor, he had to believe that this would be manifested physically somehow. And he eventually develops this concept of muscular armor. And he came to believe that in working with patients, you could work either way. You could work characterologically, you could work on the musculature, but you'd be working on one and the same thing. It's not like they're two different things. They're just two different ways of working on the one thing. In any case, he was a materialist. Next, he was a rationalist. And this is a little bit more complicated. It combines with his naturalism. As I said earlier, for Reich, what is natural is also rational, and what is irrational is unnatural. Reich believed that there was a rational universe that the secrets of which one could uncover through scientific investigation. And so he had certain fundamental commitments. For example, he believed that if two things appeared the same, there was a good reason, there was probably a reason why that would explain it, and thus he draws incredible analogies between the formations of galaxies and the formations of hurricanes, etc. He also talks as if he's an instrument of the logic of his discoveries. And it's funny language. Let me read this. It's from Function of the Orgasm. Everything owes its existence to the remarkable course of scientific logic. It is not false modesty when I say that I feel myself to be merely an instrument of this logic. Now that language could be very confusing. That language could sound mystical, like someone's guiding Reich or something like that. He's not saying that. He's just saying that he was following this thread, and that led him to great differences, but there was a logic to the world and a logic to his uncovering of the world. He's also a rationalist in the sense that he has certain fundamental commitments, such as this notion of antithetical aspects being at heart one. So if you have two things like sexuality and anxiety, they seem antithetical, but they're both expressions of life energy. And the life energy can either express one way or the other. So beneath the antithetical, there's a unity. And that's almost a direct quote from Reich. This is a quote. Out of the unitary force, a splitting, an antithesis develops. That is my way of thinking about natural scientific things. Well, that's what I'm calling a rationalist commitment, which he then has to instantiate empirically. He has to get out and do the work. And finally, he was an empiricist. From everything I've heard, Reich was incredibly intuitive as a therapist. He was brilliant that way, and I think also intuitive about the universe. And he might have attributed that to his contactfulness or to his organonic sense. But whatever intuitions he had, they then needed to be substantiated empirically. That he was a scientist, and we're going to talk about that especially in the second talk. End of philosophy lesson. I'll distribute the blue books now. Okay, I want to now move to this notion of the relationship between Freud and Reich, and then I'll turn to the movement from psychoanalysis to vegetotherapy. So first, both Freud and Reich were natural scientists. Freud's laboratory was the treatment room initially in hospitals, and then later in his own private treatment room, and then his incredible intellect. He just read a lot and synthesized a lot. Reich's laboratory was the private treatment room. I think we're going to have that door closed, Louis. It's too distracting for me, and maybe for others. And I assume you'll get your money back. We're not going to pay rent for this. This is Reich's laboratory was the private treatment room, the clinic, because in addition to working in Freud's free clinics, he started his own clinics in Vienna in 1929. The streets, because he was in the streets, the political organizations he belonged to, and then his non-political organizations, but eventually the laboratory. And then, of course, his great intellect. He read a lot, synthesized a lot. In terms of the sciences relevant to both Freud and Reich, Freud was very much interested in chemistry and the biology of his day. He even considered at one point that psychology could be put on a neurological basis. Some of you may know the project for a scientific psychology that he wrote in 1895. It was never published during his life. But he was also, as clearly developed in Frank Selloway's book. Here's his name. It should be visible. He was very much interested in evolutionary biology. Freud, that is. Reich read widely in chemistry, physics, biology, and when he comes to the United States, he develops orgone biophysics, but that's beyond our purview today. We're going to stick in Europe. They were both materialists. Freud never doubted for a second that there was some physical basis to libido, that there was some physical basis to the unconscious, etc. He just didn't know exactly what it was. He looked various places. And neither Freud nor Reich believed that there was such a thing as the mind trapped inside the body, or that it could somehow live beyond the body, except maybe through their works. There is a guy in Germany who makes accumulators who insisted that for years he was channeling Reich. He would go into seances and then speak